Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session titled "Why Mass Incarceration Matters to American History and to Teachers in American Schools." We'll be joined by Heather Thompson from the University of Michigan. I'm very pleased to welcome her and to offer this compelling topic for tonight's session. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education at the National Humanities Center, and I'll be your moderator tonight. It's going to be my job and my role to mind the chat box and to pay attention to the questions that you ask and to try to flesh out this topic that we can take from theory to practice. And I want to thank you again for joining us. This webinar is an audio-based only webinar. We do have an associated PowerPoint that you'll have access to. But the real key to this is your participation through that chat box located in the lower part of your GoToTraining control panel. I highly encourage you to ask questions, to respond to prompts, to share resources, to record your insights. And as I pay attention to those, if for some reason the conversation gets pretty active and your question scrolls up and rolls out of view, don't hesitate to type it in again or to ping me with a private message, and I'll be happy to make sure that we bring that up at the right time. The National Humanities Center is really dedicated to these kinds of bridges, that is the bridge between the scholarly world, the academic world, the research world, the expert world, and the world of teachers, which are experts in their own rights. And that bridge, in my view, oftentimes is more than outreach, it's in reach as well. So this conversation should be back and forth, it should be extemporaneous, and again, we highly encourage you to bring your own experiences into this conversation. Each year we have a cohort of fellows who are selected from an application from university professors from around the country. They come to the center in Durham, North Carolina. They do their good work. They write their book. They do their research. They have conversations. They work on their digital project. And then our education department is designed to extend that, not only extend it literally, that is the actual work being done at the center and the research that's being conducted, but also to find ways to implicitly extend that, to emphasize the process of that work, to find ways to connect that with the classroom and with the curriculum that we teach. We do this in a variety of ways. That includes a free online repository of instructional resources. Please visit American Class. Right now we're getting about 1.2 million unique visitors a year. And we very much encourage you to use these both as exemplars, but also as aspirational materials. That is, materials that you can see how we stitch them together and then apply them to your own class and your own teaching. Webinars, including the one that you're joining tonight, are intended to inspire that kind of conversation between scholar, teacher, teacher, and scholar. We are at the back end of our annual series. After tonight, we've got 4 more on our slate. But I've literally just today solidified next year's schedule, and I think you'll find that those topics are just as compelling and just as relevant for the world that we teach in. We also try to emphasize the process of working in the humanities, and I do want to call your attention to one new resource, a project we just recently completed called Humanities in Class, How to Think and Learn in the Humanities. And in this project, we assembled 20 experts, 10 teachers and 10 scholars, and in pairs, we asked them to articulate the real process of their discipline, what it's like to think in, to research in, and to teach in each of these disciplines. We asked them to identify best practices. We asked them to define the value, to talk about the approach that they have as they move into their work. And we asked them to create an annotated set of resources that can continue that conversation. I think from the National Humanities Center's perspective, what it allows us to do is not only see the broader trends in the humanities and the ways that disciplines connect, but maybe as importantly, we can see the ways that disciplines have a very unique vocabulary and fluency, that there is a disciplinary process, and asking kids to be aware of that, asking students of all ages to be visible in that thinking is a big part of what we hope to do. I think you'll find this digital textbook to be very interactive. We've really worked hard to make sure that all the media that we collected and captured is presented in a way that can be interactive for you, the teacher, as well as the students that you work with. And you can download this for free from iTunes, from our iTunes channel, and I'd encourage you to do that. That'll give you a chance to view it and to interact with it, but also find ways to pull out certain sections and share that with your students, whether it's through mobile devices, whether it's through captured and downloaded resources, or whether it's projected to a group audience. All the work that we do is informed by a teachers advisory council. This 14-person group is an assembled and very talented group of teachers from across the country. And it's their job to keep us honest, to make sure that we remain relevant and credible in terms of the real classroom that all of you just shut the door on. If any of you would be interested in working with us and contributing to the center in the 2018-19 academic year, we'll be announcing our call for nominations in the coming month. So that's a quick orientation and introduction to the center. Again, tonight's session is an opportunity for you to really engage with both the material and the conversation around this topic. Once you complete tonight's session, you will be prompted for a survey, and once completing that, you will receive a link to download a certificate of participation, and you can share that with your central office or insert it into your teaching portfolio and have record of your work with us tonight. We've done a lot of really interesting topics this year. I think we've worked with a lot of scholars who offer a strong curricular perspective to the work that we do in the humanities. And I think we tried to assemble this year's webinar series based on that need to understand the contemporary world we live in. But I'm not sure that there's many as important as the one that we'll work with tonight. And it seems to me that this is a curricular and an extracurricular conversation. It's the climate and culture of the schools we work in. It's the health and welfare of the students, both plural and singular, that we all dedicate to each day. And I'm very pleased that we're able to really invite all of you to contribute to this better understanding of the school to prison pipeline, of mass incarceration in general in America, and maybe to answer that key question that we've posed with the title, which is why this matters and why this is something that all of us, both in the classroom, in administration, in centers like the National Humanities Center, really do need to keep at the forefront of our thinking. I'm going to welcome Heather Thompson from the University of Michigan to join us tonight. Heather, can you hear me?
I can.
Now we've got a little bit of an echo, so
okay. Hang on.
All right, let's try again. Heather, are you there? One more time. Hey there, Heather, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Fantastic, you can. So again, this is the wonderful part about working with teachers, is we all work with our knees bent, and the technology is not always our friend. So you're here. Thank you for joining us. You've probably had this conversation many times, but maybe not with an audience quite as engaged with the actual topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on tonight. I am really grateful to be here, particularly to talk to teachers. I've had the opportunity to present before in various NEH seminars to both high school and middle school teachers, and it's I feel like it's really the most important audience to talk about this, and also to hear feedback from all of you. I'm really grateful you're here, and I know you've already had very long days, so I'm particularly grateful that you're here. We do have a little bit of a technical issue in that I'm not able to advance my slides, so you'll have to forgive me if I am asking Andy to move on to our next slide. But just really quickly, I hope that you were able to get some of the materials I gave you. Those are materials that I would use in the classroom and also in other teacher trainings that I've done. But I'm hoping that to kind of step away from those first and just give you an overview of why I think that this topic matters. Just kind of a much broader overview of the subject, and then bring it back to the issue of schools. So Andy, why don't we go ahead to that first slide? Just to really get us oriented. You've noticed that there's the title Mass Incarceration in the first slide, and that's because we're really talking about this huge change to our policy in the last 40 years, really dramatic, where we've responded to most social ills through the criminal justice system in a way that we never had before. And if you just look at this graph, you can see what's really startling about it is that when we talk about mass incarceration, it's not just state prisons, although from wherever you are, you know that there's a lot of prisons in your state. This is a much bigger issue than just state prisons, and I think this graph really illustrates that. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that not only is this massive, but it also places us as a huge international outlier. We have more people now incarcerated or under correctional control than any other country on the planet. And you see some of them here, but it really wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter what country we put ourselves next to. We would be a national outlier. In the next slide, you can kind of see these two things together, how massive it is and how much of an international outlier. The next slide, though, makes a really important point, which is that this is not just how many people, it's a very specific demographic. It is way disproportionately Black and brown people who are locked up or under correctional control. On the top slide, you'll see it's the United States more generally, but I've also just picked a few states there. I know we have some participants. I see Charlotte, North Carolina just popped up, where I used to live and taught at UNCC for many years. And you can see North Carolina here on the left. It's way disproportionate. Michigan, where I live, very disproportionate. Vermont, California, there's a lot of folks from LA I saw on here. And so it really doesn't matter where you are, it's very disproportionate. The next slide, though, shows you what that really means in comparative terms. This is how disproportionately we incarcerate, in this case, Black men, versus South Africa at the height of apartheid. So that just is a kind of a humbling slide to really demonstrate how dramatic this is. And I always have to stop here and say that there is a tendency of people who don't know a lot about this subject to think that there's a correlation in some manner between who's incarcerated and who's committing all the crime. And we don't have time in this particular webinar to go into all of those details, but I can assure you, as someone who has studied this in intimate detail and have been on many federal panels to study it, that is simply not the case. It has much more to do with where policing is deployed and with low-level policing than it does with the crime rate in general as we would understand it. And in fact, if you look at drug crimes, which is probably the most, the greatest filler to our prisons, which will be the next slide, you'll see that in fact, white folks not only use more drugs than other races, but actually sell more drugs. And I just put that up there to kind of remind us that we're talking about a social system. It's a policy response to social problems as much as it is a response to crime. So think of it this way. We've always had crime in America, but we've never responded to it quite the way that we have done so in the last 40 years. The next slide, though, really brings it home for all of us here tonight, which is how many young people are part of this system. And this is a very humbling slide, because this is large scale locking up of young people. So young people under the age of 18, but a real shocking number under the age of 14. So you're talking about very, very young children. And if you could see some more details behind these graphs, you would see that what's really startling about it is how many young people are actually not detained because of having committed a felony or having even committed a violent act. It has a lot more to do with detention than actually sentencing, which is itself an alarming trend. Okay.
So Heather, I'm sorry, I'm going to pause you just for a moment. And this is such a sort of a jarring slide that you've added. And you know, we've got a room full of teachers now, and I'm going to ask them actually just to linger on this for a moment, because it really does. You know, this speaks to the youth that we all dedicate our lives to, and it also strikes me that, you know, the distinction you just made of age is incredibly critical, in the sense that once you get in the system as a young person, you can't get out of the system. Is that correct?
Well, that's right. And the other thing to note about this slide is that in any given day in your classrooms, and maybe year to year, you will have children that have actually been in this system that are back out, or they'll go in, they'll come back out, they'll go in and they'll come back out. So some of this is not even, it's not even so much that it is a static pie graph. It's actually very fluid, and that causes huge impacts on classrooms. One of the teachers has asked what's responsible for this massive shift. It's a complicated answer, but what we know now, having studied this, is that it was a deeply political response to the 1960s. For those of you who teach history, you know that right after the Civil War, there was such social dislocation after the Civil War that the response in many southern states was to criminalize spaces in completely new ways. And so, for example, in Georgia, the Georgia State Penitentiary went from being all white to all black in 20 years after the Civil War. And that wasn't because white folks stopped committing crime and black folks lost their minds. It had to do with a policy response to social dislocation. The same thing really happens after the 1960s. And so even though the crime rate actually is not dramatic, it has a very dramatic response in the criminal justice system. And we're going to see that as we walk through these slides a little bit more.
And I don't want to get it too far ahead of what you may share coming up, but I wonder if there was another hinge point, and that's Columbine, in which there are more school resource officers who responded to young people with a law enforcement background rather than a teaching background.
That's right. And indeed, what it's really reflecting is that teachers are often put in the position of not just being social workers, but also being police officers. And so schools often tend to resemble many of these institutions we're seeing here that we're calling detention centers. The boundaries between them become very fluid in unfortunate ways.
Thank you.
So the next slide basically just asks, so what? In other words, why am I telling you all this? Much of this, of course, you already know from your classrooms, whether they're rural or whether they're urban. You know that you're seeing a lot of this fall out in your classrooms. But my point in the next slide is to really just stress that I think this matters a great deal. And there's many ways that mass incarceration matters. If we had all night, we could talk about how it matters to our economy, to voting, to our democracy. We could go on, but for right now, I want to go to the next slide and really just talk about how it matters to our cities, because so many teachers, and this is not to leave out rural teachers, but for a moment, we'll focus on cities because so many teachers are in urban districts. And mass incarceration has deeply shaped our cities in a way which in turn shapes our schools. So what do I mean by that? Well, the next slide, you'll see a phrase called the criminalization of urban space. And what that means is that after 1971, we started to take things that had always been illegal and make them much more illegal. In other words, give them much higher penalties, much more serious consequences. But we had also decided that a whole lot of things were illegal that had not been. So this has to do with all kinds of school rules that become illegal. So you've seen that firsthand. But even in the cities, you know, things that used to be misdemeanors or, you know, just socially inappropriate become criminalized. Now, someone asked earlier, why did we do it now? The next slide. Again, it has a lot to do with the political moment just before the 1970s. As the next slide will show you, we didn't do it for why you might think. Everyone thinks, well, the 60s, so crime-ridden, that's why we did it. It turns out that we actually begin this war on crime in 1965 with Lyndon Johnson, actually not Nixon. And if you look at this graph, you'll notice something pretty astonishing, which is that the murder rate hadn't been that low since the 19-teens. And, you know, I always go straight to murder because I figure that, you know, someone is either dead or they're not. So we're not even going to quibble over crime, you know, how we're defining crime. This is a pretty clear graph. And if you look at the next graph, you'll see something else that's a little shocking, which is that by 1995, actually, violent crime was through the roof. Which means that when we are knee deep in the war on crime, when we've decided to criminalize urban space, we actually create a crime problem. And I'll just stop there to say we shouldn't be surprised for those of us who teach social studies, because of course that's exactly what happened during Prohibition. In this case, it's the war on drugs. But at the turn of the century, when we got Prohibition, you all know that, for example, the murder rate in Chicago went up by 78% once we made alcohol illegal. In this case, going to the next slide, this isn't about Prohibition. This is about really criminalizing urban space after the civil rights 60s. This is Philadelphia, but it could be Rochester, New York, Harlem, Detroit, Watts. It doesn't matter. This was a lot of urban rebellion in the North. And one way to think about it is like this. Remember when there's all kinds of civil rights activism in the South, and you had people like Sheriff Bull Connor saying, those guys are not civil rights activists, they're a bunch of thugs, criminals. And they brought out the police dogs and so forth. Well, for Northern politicians, when they looked at that, they got very self-satisfied. And they said, oh, that's because of the racists in the South. Well, then all of a sudden, you start seeing Philadelphia exploding, and Detroit, and LA, and Harlem, and Rochester, New York. And a really interesting thing happens, which is the same thing that had happened in the South. All of a sudden, people say, well, that really wasn't civil rights disruption. It wasn't protests for better jobs or whatever. It was unrest and thuggery, and laws start to change overnight. So the next slide really lays this at the doorstep of LBJ. But guess what? This is not a partisan comment, because every president thereafter, Republican, Democrat, will pile it on. And again, the next slide points to what I'd mentioned earlier. We've been here before. We did the same sort of thing right after the Civil War. The next slide, though, confines us really to this period. So this is in the last 40 years, and this is all in our collective memory. The first thing that happens to really lead to mass incarceration is a massive revolution in how we treat drugs. Drugs as not a public health crisis, as it in fact is, but drugs as a criminal offense. And if you look at the next slide, you see that because of the way we started to criminalize drugs, all of a sudden the numbers of people in prison go through the roof. Look at this data. Just in 10 years, almost 1 million more people under some form of correctional control for a drug offense. If you look at the next slide, though, you'll see something pretty astonishing, which is that most people were arrested for possession, not for sales and manufacture. That's important, because that means we were not locking up Noriega. We were locking up people that had small amounts of drugs on them, and usually that is connoted with addiction. The next slide points to why those figures were so racialized that I showed you earlier. Look at this. Let's spend some time on this slide for a moment. This is who's arrested for marijuana in the 25 most populous counties in the United States. LA, Cook County, which is where Chicago is, Harris County, Dallas. Go on down the line, and this is for people who have marijuana. And you quickly see, no one believes for a moment that white people are less inclined to smoke marijuana than black people. But if you look at this data, you see that it's really about where we deploy policing. It's really about what areas are more criminalized, and that translates into those figures I showed you early on. So the next slide points out that not only do we have a revolution in drug law, but we have a revolution in sentencing. It used to be that our sentencing was more like other countries. Nowadays, if someone commits a crime and if you hear that they got maybe a 5-year sentence or a 10-year sentence, we feel like, oh my God, that's so light. But of course, the idea that 30-year sentences, 20-year sentences, life sentences are normal, that's a real creation of the last 40 years. Now for children, I just have to pause and say, we now have more children serving life sentences than at any other point in American history.
Sorry, can you say that again, Sid?
More children serving life sentences than at any other point in American history, and at and compared to any other country on the planet.
That's absolutely startling.
Yeah, so in my state, we have almost 400 children serving life sentences. And until the Supreme Court just stepped in, a startling number of them were serving sentences called life without the opportunity for parole. The Supreme Court finally ruled that that is illegal. And we are now starting to re-sentence juveniles to at least have the possibility of parole. But again, remember that first graph of juvenile justice. It's a staggering number of people that are now locked up longer than they've ever been, which also contributes to the mass incarceration. I see a question about what are they incarcerated for? Well, it would be, I wish I could make it easy and say, well, they're all murderers, rapists, and thieves. But unfortunately, That is not the case. There's a way disproportionate connection between homeless youth and youth that get locked up, poor youth and youth that get locked up, drug addicted youth and youth that get locked up, and also all manner of non-violent crimes. In fact, a study in Virginia showed that only about 0.4% of children that had been arrested on school property and ended up in the system had been arrested for an actual violent crime. So it's something that we definitely need to contend with. If you go to the next slide, though, that really brings us to the universe that all of you have to work in every day. It wasn't just that we criminalized city blocks when we had sweeps for drugs or stop and search, but we also completely changed the way that we operated schools. Many schools, I know some people that are in the webinar tonight have police in your schools, and I will tell you that that is also a new thing historically. 90% of school districts that got police in them did not do so until 1967, 68, 69, or again in the 90s. Why those two dates? Because remember what I said, the first wave of this was a response to civil rights activism, and deeply so in the schools. The second wave was actually under the Violent Crime Bill of 1994 that pushed all kinds of money into schools to hire police officers. Now, that too had major consequences. If you go to the next slide, all kinds of policies came from that. The most dramatic one that you all had to live with is the zero tolerance policy, which, you know, sounds good in principle, but what it literally meant was that teachers were put on the front lines of having to essentially be law enforcement officers. And of course, what would happen is the tensor, in the tensor districts, teachers would have tensor and more conflicts in the classroom, in part because classrooms became more heavily police spaces. Again, if you look at the next slide, we're talking about often very young children. This was a story in the Bronx. Wilson Reyes, 5 years old, fight on the playground with a fellow kid, pretty benign, but it ended up getting the police called. He was taken away in handcuffs. And if you see this slide, you can see he's actually handcuffed to the wall, where he was, by the way, much of the day before anyone told his parents. But there's been a lot of these cases of very, very young children, and that is often because the teacher is not necessarily calling the police or even want to call the police. They understand the child and the environment that they're coming from, but because of zero tolerance, the police are automatically triggered, prosecutions are automatically triggered, and so forth. Now, just to kind of jump ahead, the next slide is making the case that the fallout from all of this has been pretty staggering. And now what I'm going to tell you is a little bit about how this connects the city with what you see every day in the classroom. Every ounce of this mass incarceration has had a really, really profound effect on urban neighborhoods in particular. In the next slide, we call that million-dollar blocks. And some of you might have heard about that. Million-dollar blocks are the term that was given when there's such high rates of incarceration that essentially it costs $1 million to lock up everybody on that particular block. It's actually a misnomer because it's billion-dollar blocks, really, when you think about the money that it cost. But it's a good way of thinking about it, because if you go to the next slide, I'm just sharing with you a slide from Detroit. This is where I live. And the top slide shows you the entire east side of the city of Detroit. And you can see that 1 in 22 adults, 1 in 22, are under some form of correctional control. And if you take that down to a very specific neighborhood, the bottom slide, Brewer Park, 1 in 16 adults are under some form of correctional control. Now, what's going on? Well, there's all kinds of things going on, not the least of which is lack of jobs in the area, heavy policing in the area, mostly an illegal drug trade in the area. But at the end of the day, what it means is that so many people are removed from the community that if you go to the next slide, the primary result of it has been an orphaning of children. Now, not literally, because we have lots of grandmas that step in to raise children. We have lots of extended family members. But what it literally means is that children have very, very fragile resources at home before they come into classrooms every single day. Many of them are suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome. There's a very important story I heard from a police chief just to kind of underscore this. Many of them have experienced drug raids on their properties, and one of the police chief was talking about how now he always brings in a sheet when he does the raid, and the person he was actually telling the story to was a little mystified. Well, what do you mean? Why do you bring a sheet? And the reason is because he said most times people have a dog, and the first thing that they have to do is shoot the dog. And that is so traumatizing for the children that it's easier if they have a sheet so that the children don't see the dog bleeding out. Now, I know that's a very graphic story, but the reason I tell you that is because that is the kind of collective trauma that so many children are living with before they ever step through the door of a classroom. They've watched their parents taken away. And again, one could say, well, then why are their parents doing that? Okay. Well, let's go to the next slide, which is about the other ironic impact of mass incarceration. When you have been arrested for being, for example, involved in the drug trade, which, mind you, in many communities, that is the only job in town, then you have a record. And if you have a record, you can't get a job because you have to declare that you have a record. You also can't enter college, because most colleges will ask you to declare that you have been convicted of a crime. You can't get financial aid, and you also cannot get welfare. The next slide. So here's the greatest irony. You come out, maybe you've even done a very short sentence, but you are no longer able to qualify in many, many states for food stamps, for shelter, for any of the benefits, plus you can't get a job. So essentially, the criminal justice system has created this never, never world where nobody can do anything other than go back to an illegal economy. This is why we have recidivism rates of bordering 78%. So needless to say, the next slide makes the case that this has a long, long reach, okay? And I hinted to you that we keep touching into the classroom, but I will point out that there are other things we should consider as citizens. The next slide points out that it has a big impact on our economy, very similarly to the way it did after the Civil War. There's some really interesting parallels for those of us who are kind of history buffs. The next slide points out that after the Civil War, not only did we criminalize space in new ways, and remember I told you the Georgia Penitentiary went from being all white to all black, but we also put people to work in prison labor. And in fact, that's the way much of the New South was built in the wake of the Civil War. Well, guess what? We do the same thing after 1965. We essentially criminalize space in new ways, make things a crime that had not been a crime before, and then we put people to work. So if the next slide points out, prison labor is now an issue again, which it's not been for 100 years. In fact, prison labor was completely outlawed during the Great Depression, during the New Deal. And once we get mass incarceration, lots of businessmen said, well, look, this is a captive audience. Let's reinstitute prison labor. And so they do. So the next slide points out some of the places that began to use prison labor. A lot of private companies began to use prisoners, because it was just South Carolina in particular was very much attracting businesses to do labor in prisons because those prisoners could not, call in sick or file workman's compensation claims. But the other thing was, the next slide, we also began to privatize prisons themselves and privatized punishment. So we got all kinds of private prisons, private detention centers. And here is the really interesting thing. Privatizing punishment meant that pretty soon you had a profit motive for criminalizing urban spaces. So notably, people who were making money off of building prisons or servicing them. So think about it this way. Everything from tampons to tasers to telephones are now big business in prisons. And those were the same companies that were passing the draconian drug laws and passing the heavy, heavy sentencing laws. Now, meanwhile, we're just voters, we're just citizens trying to get by in our lives, but this is what goes on behind the scenes. So the next slide really makes the case that the sum total of all this is that it creates a crisis. It creates an urban crisis. By the way, it creates a labor crisis because all of those jobs that used to be done on the outside, of course, are now being done on the inside. You know, Anderson flooring, Victoria's Secret catalog ordering, baseball, you know, trophies for our kids when they play Little League. These are all being made in prison, which means there's fewer jobs on the outside. And we've already talked about what it means when you don't have jobs. All of this, I want to say, matters to teachers, which is really the next slide. Why haven't we changed this, though? And this brings us into the final piece. If everything that I just told you is true, and just trust me for a moment that it is, the logical question is, why haven't we changed this? Now, there has been, I will tell you, some movement towards criminal justice reform. And there has been a lot of movement in that. In fact, prior to our recent presidential election, I was involved in a lot of stuff at the national level where it didn't matter whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. There was a lot of sentiment that this was a crisis, that we needed to change it. And there was a lot of criminal justice reform energy in the air. And I think there still is, but it really has been shut down a lot. And rather than talking about dealing with this as a social problem, again, we're talking about dealing with it in terms of locking people up longer, more policing, more guns, not fewer, and so forth. And so one of the things we've had to do as scholars is think about, why is this? Why haven't we changed it? If it's so devastating, why haven't we changed it? Well, there's some actually really interesting reasons for this that have to do with mass incarceration itself. And here's a spooky thought. The very system that we built has built into it structurally a way to save itself from ever being undone. So let me explain what I mean. The next slide. Fundamentally, mass incarceration has distorted our democracy in a way that we have not even begun to fully appreciate. Now, again, this is going to have a real resonance with what happened in the 19th century after the Civil War. So let me explain what that means. It means that when you are locked in a prison, in most states, you then lose your right. Well, in all states, you lose your right to vote when you are in prison, right? Now, remember that before mass incarceration, that did not have a major impact. But if you've got 65 million Americans with a criminal record, which today we have actually almost 100 million, that matters, okay? So in 1974, this was starting up. People were starting to lose their right to vote in prison, and even worse, when they did their time, they couldn't vote even when they got out of prison. And this was challenged at the Supreme Court level, next slide, in 74 in a case Richardson versus Ramirez. And it was ruled at the Supreme Court level that it was perfectly okay, in a very, very tortured reading of the 14th Amendment. And by 2006, 48 out of 50 states had disfranchisement laws on the books. And that had not looked like that since when? Right after the Civil War. And one of the reasons why there was such a disproportionality of Black incarceration after the Civil War was because not only, if you locked everybody up, could you be put to work, but you also couldn't vote. And we all know that one of the greatest threats to racial, the racial situation in the South was if every Black folks had the vote, it was going to change it. Well, notably, after 1965, we did something similarly. Remember, Johnson passes the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? That was a result of great civil rights activism. We finally get the Civil Rights Act of 65. Well, No sooner did we do that than we started this massive crime program and mass incarceration, which in effect undid much of the good of the Voting Rights Act of 65 in the same way that it had done after the Civil War. So the next slide shows you just a glimpse of what that looks like in terms of disfranchisement. Andy, you got the next slide? There you go. These are disfranchisement. It's a little difficult to see, but these are the places where you have had, there is some barrier to voting depending on where you live. And I'll just let you look at that for a moment. It literally means that there is no state in this country but two where you have free reign to vote when you get out of prison, and nobody in prison can vote. Okay? So remember, we've got about 2.5 million people locked up. That has a very profound impact. The next slide shows you that graphically. Here's the states with the most African American felony disfranchisement, but they're by no means the only one. It's a little bit misleading because every state you see up here is the South. But in fact, I just wish I had another graph to show you. I don't have one. They didn't make one at the Urban Institute. But in fact, if you live in Vermont or you live in Maine or you live way up north, you actually have far greater racial disproportionality in imprisonment than you do if you're in Louisiana or Florida. So for example, it's about 1 to 9 black to white incarceration in a place like Alabama, where it's a far, far worse statistic if you're talking about Vermont or Maine. Now you might say, well, that's because there's fewer black folks in Vermont and Maine than white folks. But in fact, that's proportionality, so in fact that's not helpful. It means that you have a greater chance of being locked up if you're African American living in the North than you do in the South. But either way, if you look at many of these cities and southern states with high black populations, huge portions of the population are disenfranchised. They cannot vote because of mass incarceration. Okay, so if that were all of it, we would already be a little alarmed. But go to the next slide. Actually, this puts those things together in the next slide. Let's go on to the next one. There is a whole nother story here, which is the U.S. Census. So, the census, every 10 years, we all, get together and we tell everybody how many people you have living in your house and what jobs they do. It's our way of accounting for our citizenry. So we know, where does there need to be public schools? Where do there need to be things that we need? And it has always been the case that the U.S. Census has counted people who are incarcerated where they are locked up, not where they are actually from. Now, again, remember that prior to mass incarceration, the criminal justice population was pretty even and pretty small. Didn't matter. But when you have staggering rates of incarceration, it means that we are counting people not where they actually live, not where their families are, not where their children are, but we are counting them in these upstate prisons, or in the case of Illinois, downstate prisons, where they are locked up. Now think about that for a moment. That has dramatic impacts on our democracy. In essence, what it means is that in a town that has a prison, those people living there have much more political weight than the cities where the incarcerated people came from. Cities like LA, cities like Detroit, cities like Baltimore, like Cleveland. And census population does not just determine political power, right? How many senators you get, how many representatives you get, but it also determines resources, how much money you have for public schools, for example. So what that means is that let's say a young man is incarcerated in Detroit, he has 2 children, he is shipped off to upstate Michigan, where his prison is. His body is counting for political power in that upstate Michigan town where the prison is, which, by the way, is overwhelmingly white. He is unlikely black if he is from Detroit, just because of the demographics of the city. And that means that, like in this 19th century, it's like a return to the 3/5 clause, because he can't vote, but the very presence of his body in a prison community gives that community more voting power. Plus, his children back in Detroit, there is less money for their public schools, their child nutrition programs, etc. So it's a very it's a lot to really absorb. But that leads us to the next slide, which is all of us. In other words, the people who can vote. Like, why is it that the next slide points to, you, me, everybody who does it? Like, if the people who are most affected can't change it through the ballot box, what about us? Why do we keep voting for harsher drug laws when we know that it's not working? Or why do we keep voting for more criminalization when we know the fallout from it in our classrooms is so great? Well, here's the thing. It's quite sad. Deep down, I think that it's fear. Most people don't like the impact of mass incarceration, but the reality is there's sort of a secret wonder, like, well, but does it work maybe? Because we've been hearing lately that the violent crime rate is at an all-time low. So does that mean that when we get mass incarceration, that's why our crime rate is so low? In other words, it's ugly. I don't like to think about children locked up for life, but is that why we have a really low crime rate? In other words, does it work? Well, guess what? It doesn't. We have spent I can't tell you how many resources and how much energy studying this exact question. What is the connection between high rates of incarceration and the crime rate? And if we were in a room together, you could see my arms, you would see that I'm going to demonstrate the crime rate as a wave, up, down, up, down, up, down. Throughout American history, the crime rate goes up and down. But the incarceration rate, which for much of American history had been a flat line, since 1970 goes straight up. And it's disaggregated from the crime rate. In other words, we've had moments in American history with high crime rates and low incarceration rates, and moments of high crime rates and high incarceration rates. They're actually disaggregated. But here's what we do know. In communities that are very heavily incarcerated, so particularly poor communities where there's a heavy presence of police and there's a lot of arrests going on and a lot of parents being taken away, we do know that actually the violence rate increases. And we saw it during Prohibition, and we're seeing it again right now. So to the extent that incarceration is related to crime, it's actually causal. In other words, high rates of incarceration cause more distress than they solve. And so it is important that we think about all this as teachers, both as sort of what we teach, but also as citizens. But as importantly, we bring it home to our classroom. So the next slide. Why is it that I do these talks, or, particularly to high school teachers, middle school teachers, frankly, also increasingly elementary school teachers? It is because the classroom has become the place, very, very unfortunately, for all of you who have to do this work every day, that gets to feel the fallout from this most directly. You feel the fallout of the children who have been orphaned to this drug war and incarceration. You feel the fallout of the poverty rates that have soared because of it. And you've been put in the front line of having to actually administer it through the zero tolerance policies, and to be that person that ends up having to suspend a child when you know that suspension makes that child about 80% more likely to end up in the criminal justice system and not graduating from high school. And not because it's your choice, but because that's the apparatus. Most public schools now have a direct relationship with the DA's office. and with the police department. So increasingly, teachers are resisting this, and they are thinking about other models for how to deal with misbehavior, how to deal with drug addiction, how to deal with trauma, how to deal with homelessness, and restorative justice practices have been really remarkably successful. I have given some of those readings have come from local schools that have done this work for us to kind of think about, and so maybe that's a good place for us to stop. What do I have another slide, Andy? I've lost track here on my own end. Yeah, so these are some of the examples of various places that have taken the experiment with restorative justice with enormous success, and some of that I believe is in your packet. It doesn't mean that these are always effective. It's very helpful. They're more effective when administrators and teachers work together on them, and it's even more effective when the relationship with the DA's office and the police department is minimized. Where it's not been effective as much is when police have mini police stations in the schools and then try to do it, because the instant you have police in the schools, automatically things that children have been doing from time immemorial become criminalized in a way that they wouldn't have been even in 1950. I'll leave you with one thought on this, which is that a big study was done that actually was the study that led to zero tolerance policies. And it came out of Virginia, and the entire report got administrators in high schools and middle schools deeply alarmed, because it basically suggested that young people today are a new breed of violent. Some of you may remember this from the 80s, even the super predator kid, the crack baby, those kinds of things, right? And it turns out, and so seriously was this report taken, that the Surgeon General began quoting from it, and many administrators began quoting from it. And it turns out that it was completely made up. And indeed, the author of it actually even said that it was meant to be a rhetorical device to really get people to be leery of the public school system. The University of Virginia's School of Education, the Curry School, has done some amazing studies that have shown that actually children today are not more violent than they ever were. We do have a terrible problem now with, as we know, with school shootings. But all of the research done on that actually shows that that has much more to do with the heightened criminalization and placing guns in children's hands than it does with anything innately more violent about our children. So, and again, I just saw one of our teachers said that you work in a high-income district and suspensions are the last resort. I'm so glad you said that, because that was actually what I was going to leave us with. When we throw up our hands and we're not quite sure how to do differently what we're doing already in the classroom, I always think to myself, the answer is actually pretty simple. We do what it is that we would want done with our own children, and what, in fact, schools that have high resources do with their own children. If it were true that lots of police in the schools made schools safer, then that's where everybody would want to go, right? But when you see a school that has bars on the windows, lots of cop cars out in front, that is actually the last place that people want to send their children. People want to go to places where there are restorative justice models, not punitive models. And but unfortunately, to get teachers on board with this and to get administrators on board, this bigger history sometimes is really important, because it makes us understand that we're in this mess for very political reasons and for reasons that have made things worse, not better. So I guess this is a great time for us to open up for comments, questions, and so forth.
Heather, thank you. I've got several questions that were queued up as the chat rolled, and I think now we can invite everyone to start to offer their thoughts, maybe their own experiences, any questions they might have. But one question that did come up from Kimberly Cisneros, and this is sort of a direct content question, and that is, generally speaking, how long after being released can a felon vote? Is that a state by state answer?
Yes, it completely depends on the state. And oftentimes, even if there are provisions by which they can restore voting rights, and many states have those mechanisms, they're often much more difficult than they sound. So, for example, if you violate parole, you could get your voting rights back in many states, but if you violate parole, you would immediately lose them. Well, how do you violate your parole? Well, in many states, parole rules are so strict that, in some you can't have a cell phone, or you have to have a job, or there's all kinds of ways in which people keep getting bumped off the voter rolls because of how punitive the reentry process is. But it's totally a state by state question. And the sad part too is that even in places that don't have particularly rigid felon disfranchisement laws, it's been so culturally drummed into people's heads that they cannot vote, because of course they many times have not, in prison you can't vote, right? You lose your citizenship, which is a pretty which does not happen in a lot of countries but ours. And so by the time you get out, people just assume they can't vote. So it actually has a depressing factor on voting, even if legally you are allowed to vote.
That culture of voting, that culture of ownership just shifts.
Yes.
And so if this is a state versus a federal question, what states are doing it right? Do you have any examples of localities or states that seem to be trying to move in the right direction?
Well, I really don't. But if you go back to that slide, I'd have to do the research individually to answer that effectively. But if you go back to that disfranchisement map, it gives you a pretty good sense of what the, you go to the bigger one right before that, or yeah. It gives you a sense of the array, how different various locales are. But look at Florida, for example. There's been so many studies done that have shown that, it doesn't just sort of matter. Political scientists who've looked at this say that it's actually shaped every single senatorial election and congressional election since like 1992 or something. It's actually impacted the outcome. And arguably, it's this is what impacted the Gore-Bush election in Florida.
Right. Heather, when you share this, and you mentioned your own work in policy, your own work in different kinds of research studies and different kinds of committees, what generally is the pushback to what you're sharing? What is the other side of this argument?
Well, the pushback is very legitimate and it's very heartfelt, which is that, crime is real, and people get harmed when, addiction also creates a lot of harm. Crime creates a lot of harm. And so the pushback is often, well, what am I saying here? That, everybody should just run around and do whatever they want. And that's why the international comparison is usually very helpful, because it isn't like nobody who wants to change the system in policy circles is arguing that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. What they're saying is that we've never done it this way in American history before. No other country does it. And all of the data shows that it's actually making things worse. By the way, so much worse that in many districts, and I believe I saw someone raise this question in the chat room, that even restorative justice is becoming difficult for some districts to handle, because the damage from mass incarceration in this drug war is so deep now that you have generations of children who have been permanently traumatized and scarred from this. And what do children do who are permanently damaged and scarred? They act out. And so we have a healing. The short answer is that, people see really real lived bad behavior, and it's just hard to kind of connect the dots that the system itself is what's making that much worse. And, if we think about it, the way we know when we're on the right track is that when it's our own children, if they are having a complete breakdown, even if they're violent or even if they're addicted and violent, the last thing we would want to do is call the police and have them arrested. We would want them to be helped. And that's kind of the model that we try to think about this in. So the pushback is very real and makes a lot of sense, you know?
Absolutely. A couple of comments earlier, Carol Pixton connects this, asks if there's a connection to the Black Lives Matter movement. And interestingly, I would have also suggested to all of our participants that you go back into our archive and take a listen to Hura Williams' webinar with us just a few months ago in the historical context of Black Lives Matter. And Heather, I know you and Uhura do a lot of work together as well. Yes. How do you see those two things mapping onto each other?
Well, you know, one of the interesting things about the Black Lives Matter movement, the real movement, not the one that kind of gets parodied in the media and misunderstood, the actual men and women and children from communities that were so moved to march and protest police shootings, because that's really where it came from. To understand that is to understand just how much trauma I'm talking about at the community level, right? You know, the level of dealing with social problems in the criminal justice system has gotten so bad that if you look at virtually every police shooting in the last, you know, let's just talk about the famous ones, you know, the Walter Scott, you know, the Philander Castile, any of these ones that we've been seeing on the news, if you look at them, you'll realize something that's pretty humbling, which is that every single death happened after low-level misdemeanor policing. In other words, these all happened because ordinary spaces have become so criminalized. You know, getting killed for selling Lucy cigarettes, having, you know, a traffic violation, speeding away on a bike with an alleged knife. These are things that only happen when you have so many police on the ground, you have such a tense environment, and basic low-level behaviors have been criminalized. So people get sick of it and they say, why are you hassling me? Leave me alone. The next thing you know, there's a confrontation. The next thing you know, somebody ends up dead. That was what Black Lives Matters was responding to. It was really this criminalization that I'm also talking about. The same criminalization that leads to so high rates of incarceration also leads to real conflicts between police and the community. And I will say, I do a lot of talks with police too. And police and prison guards, and these are human beings as well. These are not, you know, devils. This system has pitted people, put people in an untenable situation, so that even police officers every day, they're basically, if you want to keep your job, that's the kind of policing you have to do. Constant misdemeanor policing.
And then if you take that same culture, that same mental model, and put it in a school building there, as you're suggesting, the kinds of infractions that young people do, stupid, silly, impulsive, things that kids say, things that kids get into conflict over, things that kids experiment with, result in really heavy punishment. And once they're in that punishment, then their entire view of themselves and their own identity and the way that they're viewed by others shifts, and they're stuck in the system at a very early age.
Which is why teachers often are so traumatized by the system, because they know that you know, that oftentimes there is no choice but to have a certain response to a certain child behavior, and that what will follow from that is far bigger. You know, the consequences are far more lasting. It's not just like the suspension will mean that the kid can't go to college because it's on their record. In many districts, a suspension automatically triggers involvement of the DA's office.
Right. Particularly if it's qualified as a particular kind of infraction.
Yes.
Paul Amar, who I believe is just down the road from me in Durham, North Carolina, asks about this notion of community policing and police on the ground that builds closer ties with the community. And her question is, what happened to that model? And I'm going to sort of extend that question even further and say, you know, is this, in your view, Heather, an intentional, systematic environment that's been created and sustained, and that models like that notion of police community relations are intentionally being given short shrift, or is there some other cause? How intentional is this? And if it's not that intentional, what happened to some of these models that seem successful on the surface?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a tricky one because one of the reasons we get community policing in the first place was after the uprisings that I mentioned earlier in the 1960s. That was, the response to a lot of police brutality was the community demand for community policing. And, it had some great success. The problem was that meanwhile, in the federal level and at the state level, we began this war on crime and the war on drugs, which fundamentally undercut community policing because if you basically say to your officers that they have to go out every day and keep throwing people up against a car for low level drugs, that very act of policing undermines community policing. And oftentimes in schools, it's the same problem. You have a school resource officer or a school police officer that potentially could be helpful, but if they are mandated to trigger a certain response because of zero tolerance policies, then a kid might have nail clippers in their backpack, but the next thing you know, it's classified as a weapon and they're, pulled out of school. So unfortunately, policing is just not the way to do it and that's why if you look in very wealthy suburban districts, these problems are never solved through the police department. They are always solved through the counselor's office. They are, and in fact, restorative justice practices go on every single day in high resource schools, every day. They don't call it that, but if somebody commits a harm to somebody else if something goes wrong in a high resource school, the first line of defense is to bring in the counselors, the parents, the school, the various parties who were involved. And it is a mediation restorative justice model because we know that works.
Professor Thompson, I feel like because the way we're describing this, I should probably also ask you about the more recent events in Florida and in Parkland and the national conversation around not just putting police and law enforcement in schools, but guns in schools. Do you have any view on this more recent issue and conversation?
It is a terrible, terrible, terrible idea by the estimation of anybody who has really looked at this in detail. And people have. There are extensive studies of police shootings, one of the most important of which was done by the National Research Council. In fact, I have it on my desk as we speak. And it is absolutely taking all the information that I presented tonight and saying, rather than we went down the wrong path, the wrong punitive path, so we should fix it, it says, let's double down on that punitive path, and now everybody should have guns. It is not rational on an internationally comparative standard. It's not rational on a standard compared to what we have ever done in this country before. And what we do know is that the drug war and the gun manufacturing connection is so profound that the only way you're going to deal with police shootings in schools, with shooter situations in schools, is to get guns out of schools and get guns out of homes and people's hands. Now, that doesn't mean hunting, recreational. I'm talking about this absolute free reign of getting guns. And that's what people are talking about right now. That's what these children are saying. They're not saying disarm America. They're saying get rid of this easy access to guns and this criminalized culture.
And that then leads me to my next question, which is, we've, in much of what we've talked about tonight, it's almost overwhelming, frankly, particularly for those of us in education, those of us who have experience living and working and being a part of that system. It's almost overwhelming. And as we've talked about this, children and students are sort of an anonymous demographic, right? It's the kids in numbers and graphs and pie charts. But I'm wondering your view of kids themselves. How do you see the young generation responding to this? And again, I guess I'm in some ways reflecting on what's happened more recently in the post-Parkland era. There's a very active generation now who take this very seriously, it seems. What's your view on the way that generation is responding to the system that they're suddenly aware of?
All change in American history happens when the people who are most impacted by it finally reach that breaking point and they stand up and they speak up. And I think it's very significant that young people are the ones leading some of the most important discussions that we've had in a generation on gun safety and guns in schools. And it's not a surprise. It's actually wonderful to see. And similarly, teachers are the ones leading these most important questions of equity and teacher equity that we've seen in a generation. I was watching today on the news these teachers from West Virginia talking about their recent contract settlement. And I thought it was just so moving that, these are teachers that it's illegal to strike. They don't have the right to strike. It was a wildcat strike, but they stood together. And even when I'm sorry, not the administrators, even when the governor threatened and said that if you get higher pay, we're going to take it from Medicaid and out of the mouth. They literally said out of the mouths of the children who you teach. And they basically stood together and they said, absolutely not. That's not you. We are not going to allow you to play us off each other and do that. And when they got that 5% raise, they got it not just for themselves, but for all state employees. And I feel like that's because classrooms and teachers and children in classrooms, it's what I was saying in my talk. It is the microcosm of the society as a whole, both good and bad, all the goodness, all the justice, all of the goodness, but also so much trauma plays out there. And that's why those are people who are leading the discussion for change.
And so then it seems like part of the solution, part of the answer is an awakening to the system that you've described. It's again one that we live in and work in, and maybe don't always have a strong sense that it's happening. Or, as you've also suggested, sometimes it's hard to face. It's hard to sort of open your eyes and on a daily basis, sort of look directly into the face of what you've described.
Well, and I think it's true. I will say, Andy, that the real argument for sometimes taking this bigger picture approach, like the whole bigger story of incarceration, for example, on the one hand, it's overwhelming. But on the other hand, it's very freeing because then you understand that kind of stuff that you're dealing with every single day in the classroom, it's not inevitable. It's not guaranteed. It doesn't have to be that way. It didn't used to be that way. And the thing about bad policy is that you can make bad policy, but when you see that it's just bad policy, you can also unmake it. And in that sense, seeing the big picture reminds us that we're not doomed.
Yeah, absolutely. But having said that, it seems like part of it is an awakening to the system. And I wonder if you have any suggestions to our participants, to our teachers tonight, on how they might take this to their classrooms, or maybe my question should be, when you teach students yourself, how do you take this and translate it in a classroom of students who are a part of that system without realizing it? Do you have any instructional suggestions?
I think that there's a very personal answer, and then there's a more what do I want to say, job related answer. I think the personal answer is that once you see this bigger picture, as I've described it today, it is important for me, for anyone in the classroom, to be really aware of our students. And if you see a kid who is not doing well, either because they're very angry or because they're traumatized or they're not clean, or that there's all kinds of snap understandings of why that is, and we tend to blame the parents. We say, well, that's because his mother's terrible. He's late for school every day because his mother's lazy, and if she cared, she'd get him to school, and so forth and so on. We tend to see the problem in a very narrow way, and hopefully now, I try anyway to think about the children that I deal with more in a more complex way. I mean, if they have participated or have witnessed anything I described tonight, then their situation's more complicated than having a neglectful mother, or having or just being an angry and violent kid. So it's a different context that I think can help us understand our children differently. But structurally, I do think it empowers teachers to stand together in their own classrooms and in their own districts and say, I will not run my classroom like a prison. That it's just, you talk about like sanctuary cities, it's like sanctuary classrooms. In my classroom, we're here to learn, and I'm not going to run it like a police station. And I think children throughout the country, at least what teachers tell me, is that they really, really respond to that well. They know those teachers who run the classroom like a sanctuary, not like a prison.
We have a question from Jacqueline Dukes, who asks, what do you think, Professor Thompson, about this idea of changing the ways that DAs and prosecutors are selected?
Well, and different places choose them differently. And I gave a presentation to the 35 from the prosecutors from the 35 largest districts in this country, and the thing that really struck me was how different it looks depending on the district. Some are appointed, some are elected, some have access to the grand jury, some don't, some are on the scenes of crime, some aren't. I think the bigger problem is not so much the individual, it's not so much on the individual level of that. It is much more, it's a broader collective political discussion and emotional discussion of how we want to deal with social ill, and to signal to our politicians that we don't want to lock up all social problems. We want to actually fix them. And prosecutors are very good at wanting to get elected and wanting to get seen as reflecting the public's will. So in the end, it comes from us, what we think is what needs to be done. Prosecutors will then do it.
Fantastic. Are there any other questions or comments? We're coming at the end of our webinar. Any other comments from our participants? It strikes me, Heather, that there again, we've used the word overwhelming a couple of times. We've talked about sort of the scope and the size of this, but I don't know, there's something optimistic about what you're sharing to me, and I don't want to be naive about it, but it seems like there is, maybe it is that feeling of awakening, that sort of flush of seeing the bigger bigger map of things that you feel in your daily life all the time. What makes you optimistic?
I'm very optimistic because I'm an American historian. I look at time, change over time, and I know that the thing about oppression, the thing about injustice, the thing about all of the things that keep us up at night is that they only exist as long as people tolerate it. And when the minute people stand together, it all crumbles pretty darn quickly. And again, I just call our attention to the recent news with those West Virginia teachers. I mean, it was just kind of staggering. And that first teacher that said, I think we can actually get a raise, it probably looked like the crazy person. But if you have that broader picture that nothing ever stays the same, everything is always going to change. So the question is it going to change for the better or for the worse? And history shows that we've got the opportunity to change it for the better. This system that is so bad, this criminal justice system, in the scheme of things, is pretty darn new. We've never done it like this way. No other country does it this way, and we've only been doing it this way for 40 years.
One last question, and Don, I will say to you directly into the group that we will make sure you have access to our slides and to a recording of tonight's session so you can go back and linger on and spend more time with the conversation. But one last question for you, Professor Thompson. If you've activated a lot of teachers tonight, we've had this conversation, we've all had our eyes opened. Many of them will go to their schools tomorrow, they'll talk to their colleagues and their friends, and they'll share some of what they've learned. Is there a singular or even a small selection of resources that you find to be the most useful in extending this conversation? What would be one or two takeaway resources that you want to make sure that we all have?
I would just encourage everybody that the readings that I chose for tonight, I think, I know people are so busy, it's so difficult to kind of add that on to the day, but those readings kind of give you both the mix of the the kind of history we talked about tonight, but also some examples of what's happening around the country that is very encouraging. And the good news that I've discovered is that every single school district, it doesn't matter where it is, has somebody that's doing really interesting restorative justice work and is really doing great work. Even if not that, doing work with children of the incarcerated. There's organizations to really reach out to the community in a different way on these questions. And really, it's kind of a simple Google in wherever you are will find you. It'll connect you with people that are already doing this stuff. And that's really the best way, I think, because it's happening everywhere and every district is so different, but the questions are shared.
Professor Thompson, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your expertise and your insights. I can see from the chat box, and I can see from sort of the wide-eyed understandings that we have that it's been a really meaningful conversation for us. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Have a good night, everybody.
And I want to thank all of you for joining this conversation. I think this is the kind of webinar I hope that you can't unknow, you can't unring the bell. And I hope each of you find ways to take this into your profession, to your career, to your schools, into your conversations with your students and the ways that you think of your curriculum. If you want any kind of follow-up or feedback, please do reach out to me at the National Humanities Center, to Professor Thompson. Her Twitter handle was added to the slides, and we would love to continue to find ways to support you in this work. And that certainly includes joining us on our social media. You'll have access to not only work that we've done like this, but work that we'll continue to do in the future. Don't forget tonight that you will receive a survey, and once that survey is completed, you'll receive a evaluation. If for some reason this doesn't come in, and it does seem like every time there's one or two of you who can't quite find your evaluation or your certificate, please give me an email and I'll be happy to help you out. My colleague Libby Taylor will be back at her desk on Monday, and she'll also wade into some of the emails, outstanding emails that you've sent us, and we do appreciate your patience for that. And again, tonight there will be a recording of tonight's session. This will give you a chance to go back and sort of pause and to think and to take some notes, maybe also to share it with some of your colleagues or your schools. And again, if you'd like a more sustained set of services around that, I'd encourage you to reach out to me here at the National Humanities Center. We've got just a few more sessions coming up. Some of them are sold out, like the next one, Secrecy and Democracy, the History of the FBI and the CIA, with Kathy Olmsted at University of California, Davis. After that, we'll be working with Mike Fontaine from Cornell to try to understand today's democracy through the lens of ancient Greece and the classics. You can see a theme, I suspect, from these last webinars. Those two are sold out. If either one of them are appealing to you, please email me and I'll add you to our waiting list. But we do have 3 sessions that still have a few slots left. That includes Russian fiction of the 20th and 21st centuries, Cuba and Revolution, and Orwell's 1984 with Alec Wollock of Stanford. And if any of those seem interesting, please go quickly. We only have a few slots left. Sign up, and we'd look forward to seeing you in future sessions in the Humanities in Class webinar series. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day tomorrow at school. Spring break is almost here. Hang tight. We'll be there. And don't let tonight's conversation go idly. Really think of ways that you can become advocates for this same thing. Thank you again for your participation. I'll see you next time at the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series.